Happy to welcome Pamela Richardson, who is the program head for the Master of Arts in Educational Leadership and Management program in the School of Education. She's very passionate about poetic inquiry, and I think we're going to have some participative discussion today, so it should be a really stimulating discussion. So please join me in welcoming Pamela Richardson.
Hi, thank you for being here, everybody. I'm glad we all made it, including myself. So, should we have a poet laureate? So obviously it's a rhetorical, sort of provocative question. Well, I think we should, but I'll keep going and we'll explore it a little bit more. Okay, so here's how I think things will unfold, but I'm always open to process and what actually unfolds. So I'm going to start just by setting the landscape a little bit and talking about poetic inquiry, what is it, and what's the context that it's emerging from. And then we're going to engage in some activities, totally voluntary, but I hope that if you're here, then it means you have a little bit of an interest and you might play along. Very low stress, maybe stress reducing actually. And then I want to think a little bit about this idea of what does poetry and poetic ways of knowing bring to the academy, bring to a university, bring to an institution, and this idea of maybe poet as leader or leader as poet. So we'll kind of connect into Royal Road specifically at the end and apply what we've been doing and thinking about to here. Okay, so here are some big questions. I probably won't address them all explicitly, but these might be sort of what's in the air, and some of them I'll address specifically. But maybe some of them will emerge as we're talking. So what is poetic inquiry? And what is a poem good for? So this question comes from one of my mentors, Carl Lego, who teaches poetry and language arts and literacy. And he's often asked, is this a good poem? Like, am I able to write? Is this good? So after years, he came to this question of what is it good for? And it flips this idea of the value of poetry around. So I find it a really productive question, and we'll play with it a little bit. And so what happens when we engage with an inquiry with a poetic spirit? Because I'm going to talk about this thing called poetic inquiry. So we have poetry and we have inquiry, and what happens when you put them together. What might poetry teach us, or engaging in poetic process? How can it be a teacher for us and inform us? And how might a poet be a leader, or a leader be a poet? Are there intersections between those? And what might they be? And why should we be talking about this here at a university? And not just within the Department of Education or literacy or even education, but kind of in the larger public forums and universities about what it means to know poetically. Okay, so poetic inquiry. I'm assuming because you're here, at least some of you have heard of this or are curious about this. It's an emerging approach to social sciences and human sciences research. It definitely branches off from established qualitative and narrative traditions. Many of you might know we have this narrative conference coming up in Victoria. You might want to check that out. And arts-based research. So arts-based research is a little bit newer. It really emerges from the work of Tom Barone and Elliot Eisner. And I'm not going to go in depth into what arts-based research is, but essentially it's the use of various arts-based ways of knowing, arts techniques and practices in order to surface knowledge through research. So poetic inquiry aligns with and situates itself within those research traditions. And it's very much about poetry within inquiry and within ways of knowing, within ways of understanding human experiences, within understanding social context, within understanding teaching and learning environments. So it's poetry as a pathway to understanding. And it's very interdisciplinary. So we find examples of poetic inquiry, across all these social sciences, and I don't want to, put a period at the end because I know I'm forgetting some in there. And it's so that's one of the beauties of when you go to say conferences that are poetic inquiry conferences. They really bring together, just like the narrative conferences coming up, they really bring together people from across disciplines. So there is a growing international community, and this idea of a community really, I believe, originated with the work of Monica Prendergast. She's at UVic now in the Faculty of Education. But in 2007, she was doing her postdoc at UBC, and she's actually a theater educator and an actor and a drama person, and she was working her way through these really kind of dense philosophical texts and about audience as participant and audience viewership. And she started, writing as we do, these marginal notes and all this, and she started making little poems and found poems out of the text she was reading. And then she wanted to include these in her dissertation, and her committee said, well, you have to give us a good reason for us to think that this is a good idea, right? You can't just throw this in here because you think it's cool. So she then went back into the research and started to find all these examples of poetry used as research. But nobody had really identified themselves under one title. They were calling it all these various things. And I think I have a few of those, a few of those here. So things like data poems and research poems, interview poems. So everybody was coming up with their own name for it. So she proposed to do a postdoc looking at poetic inquiry and all of these various ways. And she invited about 40 people to come together and talk about at a symposium what they were doing and why. And I was at that first symposium. It was in Vancouver in 2008. And 8, 7, 9, gosh. I can never remember. So the International Symposium for Poetic Inquiry is now every 2 years. And they have a website here, so I encourage you to check it out. So there is a venue for this kind of work if you're interested. It's interdisciplinary. It brings together people doing this work. Okay? So one thing that Monica Prendergast did is she went back into the literature and she did this huge bibliography looking at what had actually already been done. It was kind of a grounded approach to looking at poetic inquiry and what had actually been done. And she found 311 peer-reviewed journals, publications that included poetic inquiry as early as 1918 to 2012. But that being said, it's really since the late 90s that there's been this big proliferation in this kind of work, and it comes with other trends in research. So we talk about the discursive turn in terms of creating knowledge, and what that refers to is the idea that we now know that our knowledge is constructed, right? There's no such thing as an absolute truth. Everything is made by humans. We make it together, and that's knowledge. And now we're talking about this thing called the representational turn. So this concern with how we actually represent our knowledge, with the awareness that it's all constructed and what it actually means to communicate it and represent it, and all the issues that arise when we try and show what we know and represent what we know. So we'll explore a little couple of those because poetry really engages with some of these questions in productive ways, I believe. And I'm drawing quite a bit on the work of Monica Prendergast and Kate Galvin. Kate Galvin is situated in England, and there's a new volume they just put out, so I'm cribbing a little bit from them right here. Okay. So poetic inquiry draws nourishment from these methodological traditions I spoke about, but also from philosophical roots. So I've listed a few here. Really, the ones that I see really visibly in the work that I know are phenomenological impulses. So this urge to really get at lived experience and the actual experience of often participants, but sometimes the researcher themselves or groups of people. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of these names, and there's other people as well I could have cited. But it's this idea of moving away from the abstract and general metaphysical and philosophy towards particulars and concrete lived experiences. So I went fairly quickly over that. So any comments or questions or connections that you're making before I keep moving on?
So in that representational turn, Pamela, you're also talking about hermeneutics then.
Sure.
Talking about something being interpreted,
Absolutely.
represented, and brought back into a
Yeah.
conversation. So
Yeah.
that would include that whole. That's where you find Gadamer and special Heidegger and some of those other
Yeah.
things. Not just phenomenology, but that turn.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it really interpreted? But
That's right.
Turn back into this is what we're bringing back.
Right. Yeah. And
As latecomers, because we're always latecomers to experience.
sure. Yeah. And I mean, hermeneutics, I would say, definitely there's overlap with phenomenology, or like hermeneutic phenomenology, but absolutely. And I'd actually thought of putting hermeneutics up, and I thought we'll just keep. So here's a quote from Ivan Brady, and I want to think a little bit about poetry as a way of knowing, or poetic way of knowing. So instead of writing or talking through abstract concepts about their research without ever immersing deeply in the culturally constructed words of the people they study, as one might proceed in writing or applying scientific theory, poets write in and with the facts and frameworks of what they see in themselves in relation to others, in particular landscapes, emotional and social situations. So, and the reason I pulled out this quote in particular, I mean, Ivan Brady was talking about poetry versus science and the conversation that might happen between them, but also nobody should ever or would ever say that poetry is science or is pretending to be science, but what can it contribute? And poetry has a way, because of how it engages with language, it has always the frame in mind, or it makes visible the frame, because language is a culturally produced system. So when you're working with it in a conscious way, you're making visible the culture and the context that you're in. Okay? So it's this self-conscious way of working with our context. And it's also this relational way, because the purpose of language fundamentally is communication. So, and language emerges through these rich connections. It's very much part of an ecosystem. So when you're working with language, you're always working in the field of these interconnections, right? And you're working with particulars, right? You're moving away from this idea that, we can say that this is true for vast amounts of people to, this is what's true here. And, maybe there's connections, but we're starting with the particular, right? And in the particular, then we can maybe move outwards, but we're starting with the particular. We'll come back to some of these a little bit. Emotion, we'll come back to emotion a little bit. Any thoughts or comments? That's kind of a big quote. Go ahead.
In particular, I'm just curious, from just my experience of poetry is that it starts in the particular, but it becomes very quickly more universal just by its saying or its writing of poetry. But it would start as the personal experience or that lived moment. Yeah. And yet when you hear a poet, read or speak, I was just thinking even of David Whiteman here, it becomes everyone's experience. It's becoming more fully human, more feeling in our experience when we can share that particularity. Like that's, I think, the beauty of that stretch, starting with the specifics and then going to this larger, like in a word.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, go ahead, Vivian.
I just love your use of particular.
I'm also thinking about contemporary ways of poetry with rap music and I don't know, Leonard Cohen lyrics and that kind of stuff.
Totally.
It seems that that's the popular culture way of experiencing poetry, and how we take scholarly ideas and perhaps translate them into those contemporary forms as an extension of this poetic way of knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's such a kind of a rich, our culture produces such rich ways of representing and knowing, and I think increasingly there's not only openness, but this desire to engage with those forms because it helps make research accessible. It helps in the communication and dissemination piece, and they are valid ways of knowing, right? That help connect us to, the performance. Yeah. I might have another big quote here. Oh, I do. So this just again touches on the idea that this idea of locating poets in serious conversations with scientists about plural methods of getting more than the name and address of everything in the universe. So it's more than, describing and defining and, identifying these concrete bits out there and objects. And it holds the promise of new and complementary information about shared areas of study. So, this idea of a conversation between different ways of knowing, right? And rather than, silos, is, I think, promising and kind of exciting. I know scientists who are artists and musicians, and it's interesting to think about how one way of knowing influences the other. So I'm drawing back to Prendergast here and this idea of this big bibliography that she did, because what I want to do is sort of represent what poetic inquiry does, like what it is and how it's being taken up. So she identified these different voices, and sort of in a playful way, she called them, vox, and the kind of the Latin terms. And so when she went back in and looked at, I think it was close to 100 years or 90 years of literature, she found first these three different voices. So the vox autobiographia, and then the vox participare, and the vox theoria. And so she could see that people were taking up poetry and research, first of all, through writing about their own experience as researchers and kind of reflecting on their process in some way in doing autobiographical or ethnographic kind of work. And so this was kind of reflective, creative, researchers grappling with sometimes the very real tensions and experiences that they're having that don't usually have a way to make a place traditionally in the research often, right? So traditional research texts, are kind of about sanitizing and removing your own experience. And so she found researchers trying to say, put this back in as valid. And then vox participare, many of you might be familiar with this. It's written from interview transcripts or actual participant data, right? So, and I'll show you some examples of this from my own work, but, and in kind of this action research mindset, you might also want to engage participants in working with it, because it helps them engage with their stories and their words in new ways and kind of construct new meanings or clarify meanings and play with their stories. So vox participare. And then the third stream or voice that she found was people, just like she had done, writing found poems based, emerging from philosophy, whereas people doing that was engaging with these texts in poetic ways, or maybe, writing poems about poetry itself, reflecting on poetic process or the art aesthetics of poetry. Okay. Now, in 2000 so her first bibliography goes up until 2007, and then 2007, 2012, she did another bibliography, and she found there's been this increased interest in it because this community has started to emerge, right, through these conferences and publications. So she found that there's these new ways that, not entirely new, but increased interest in these kinds of ways. So she came up with the word justicia, which is social justice, specifically around class and freedom. Identitatis, which is about kind of self-reflective in the autobiographical, but specifically around race and identity, gender identity, sexuality, and poems dealing with that. Custodia would be about caring, health care, nursing. There's a strong tradition of poetic inquiry in the nursing field. Okay. And procreator would be parenting and a child rearing, I know, eh? And and it's not that those weren't present before, you know, she probably would find examples of them, but there's just been an increased, more distinct emergence of them, I guess. So that kind of gives you a sense of the different themes and the different ways poetic inquiry, the kind of work is being done. So I'm going to show you a couple of, two approaches of how I've used poetic inquiry. I think I have 4, maybe 5 examples. And then, so I'll talk a little bit about found poetry and how I've used that, and then imaginative renderings, I call them. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll hopefully do a little bit of poetry. Okay. So when I, a number of years ago, did my master's thesis, I worked with a group of girls who were radically accelerated through high school and going to university at the age of 14 or 15. So they were in this very condensed program. And I wanted to look at their experience, their lived experience of this program as girls. But I did something with them, you know, I had my qualitative data that, you know, I looked at all the themes and everything, but then I actually had them write journals, and then I did something called I poems, and I drew on the work of Carol Gilligan and something called the Listening Guide, if any of you are familiar. But the Listening Guide is kind of neat, and it's a little bit more involved than what I'll show you here, but just to give you a sense. So the girls went back into their journal excerpts, and they made I poems. So they took segments of text with I statements, and then we worked together kind of, and you know, we played with different things and made poems out of them. So just to give you a sense of one of them, I just can't take it. I tell and I tell again. I'm not used to being open. I've been trying to be, I feel. I never talk to them. I pass them in the hallways, and pretty much I am. I haven't really noticed it. I don't know. I wish people would give me a chance, invite me to ask questions. I guess I find I don't feel bad because I know. It's almost as if you can hear them. I didn't even notice. I've seen almost nothing. Right? And so one of the things that I found in doing these, and I had a bunch of examples, but is it shows kind of the tensions and contradictions that might exist in a participant's voice. Okay? It sort of highlights their own back and forthness that we all have, right? We're never one solid subjectivity or one solid version of ourselves. We always have different parts that are in kind of dancing with one another. So I find doing these I poems sort of helped not only maybe make them visible, but helped the young women I was working with look at them and go, oh yeah, you know, that's interesting. Did I say that? Huh, what does that mean? Yeah. Oh, sorry, folks. When I did this, I thought I'd have my computer and I'd be able to toggle between my slides and my desktop, because I wasn't able to actually put this example in my slideshow. So I was going to show you a PDF. Can't do that. I apologize. We're going to have to skip that one. Okay, but I'll talk about it a little bit. I guess could I just show, because it's very visual? Okay, so what I did is I worked with a book by Dorothy Dinnerstein, who's a feminist philosopher from the 70s, and I wanted to do some erasure poetry. Well, at least I thought I wanted to do some erasure poetry. Turned out about 10 pages and I didn't want to do it anymore. But I had this vision, and so I started, and it was very labor intensive, so I felt like I'd done the whole book. But what I did is I worked with pages of text, and I blacked out, like it almost looked, somebody was looking over my shoulder. I was in a cafe working. He's like, are you working with CIA documents? And I was like, oh yeah, I am. And because it's like redacted, right? Like big black stripes across my text with just some words that remain. And I mean, erasure has a philosophical tradition behind it, if you want to read Derrida. And, it's kind of like found poems in reverse a little bit, right? Because I am finding words that I want to keep, but the actual physical experience of blacking out sections of text has kind of an experience in and of itself. So maybe what I could do, show you what it looks like So here's, for example, like a version of a page, right, that looks, right, so this is what I was working with. And this is what my first version of my poems looked like, right, like that. And then they looked like this, right? So it really, like what remained. And in doing it, what I think what I was trying to do was kind of remake the text some way and take it to a new place through engaging with it in that way. So, and you know, it's hard to know how successful I was, but I did it. So, okay. Okay, so here's another found poem, since we're talking about found poem and erasure poems. And I did a series of poems based on love letters that were exchanged between Albert Einstein and his first wife, Mileva Merrick, because I wanted to think about, I was really interested in girls and giftedness and women and talent, and that's my background. So I was looking at these love letters and looking at sort of the relationship between them and how they were expressing it. And so this one here is an actual found poem. I just used the words in the letter from Albert to Mileva. And he says, "The desire to write to you conquered me. Oh, come back, you little runaway. Strength of materials, dynamics, thermal motion await you. Projective geometry. You, the shape of my soul, I cannot express. And more. Our professor, rough, impenetrable, brilliant, profound." That's my words, not his. "See how I reveal myself already? Everything you need to know tucked in our notebooks." Right. So I was interested in sort of the cultural, the sociocultural context as well. So working with the language, I was hoping to explore some of that. Okay, that's this one. So this is an example of, I did a study looking at the experience of, so I'd worked with these girls in this accelerated program, and then I worked with the grads of that program once they were in university, and was working to create community amongst them, and it was very sort of participant action research oriented. And I was using arts-based methods, and they produced digital stories after a period of time. And what I did is I took their digital story, and this stanza on the left is it's almost like my reading of their image in this digital story. So I looked at the image and I wrote what I saw. And then the young woman who created the digital story had text that went with her digital story that was fairly poetic. So I want to be in conversation with her story in a poetic way, right? I was working with students. These students were very immersed in the culture of testing and, you know, exams, and that was their whole life because they were, you know, very, very high achieving, academically oriented. And I was trying to engage with their narrative in a different way. So this is just one very tiny example of how I did that by having these two voices along the sides. Yeah. And I think this is my last example. So I was really interested in Glenn Gould, famous Canadian pianist, very famous for his work in interpreting Bach, amongst others. And I, you know, read different biographies of him, and I read a screenplay about him, and you know, did that kind of research biographical research. And then I wrote poems that emerged from the different images and words and my own experiencing of them and thoughts. So they aren't found poems. I call them renderings because it's after a period of inquiry and research, and I'm bringing together what remains for me through that process. So Gould despaired of those who paid attention to him instead of his music. He opposed applause. He composed the Solitude trilogy. A slap on the back like a hammer, like a hammer, like a hammer on a wrong note made him ill and off balance for weeks. In 1964, he stopped performing publicly, retreated to the studio until he suffered a stroke on his 50th birthday, died days later. At Fran's in Toronto, he ate scrambled eggs every night at 2 a.m. He could not eat with others. He hungered while they slept. I remember this along with how he left the stage halfway through life. The piano repertoire exhausted, he aspired to conducting and poetry. So, questions about that? I don't even know what time I'm at. How are we doing? In total, 15 minutes left? Oh, perfect. Okay. Questions about, or I'd even be curious to know if you've engaged in poetic ways in your research or with participant transcripts or anything like that. Or just questions about what you've seen, comments. Go ahead, Renee.
I'm not quite clear on the difference between the erasure poetry and the one that came after the picked words out. Isn't that almost the same?
They're similar. So I would say erasure poetry is a kind of found poetry, but found poetry traditionally, you would go into a book and like cut out pieces and words and put them all together. And whereas erasure poetry, you actually black out everything and then something reveals itself that way. It's similar though because you're working with the actual somebody else's words.
The order would be different based on erasing, the order staying the same, whereas when you pick it out, you can remove it.
Yeah, the order would be different, and the embodied experience of making one versus the other, for me, was quite different. So my actual making process felt different, left me with a different one. Erasure felt kind of destructive.
Well, I love working with poetry whenever I'm teaching, and I love it reminds me of renderings when people go for a long walk on campus or spend a long time out in the wild world. And it takes just but reading one poem when they return back, and often a floodgate of what they know and how they've come to understand this moment in time in a kind of a collision with the poet's own poetry is an amazing way to do renderings, to just let people start to bring out their own voice, the voice of the natural world, and then you also hear the rhythm of the poem that they had just heard moments before. I mean, I think people are poets.
Oh, yeah.
I think we just haven't had enough time to practice.
Yeah.
We got shut down after grade 3, so, I just think it's a beautiful way to ask people to show up in a different way.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Ways of knowing.
Heidegger would say like our basic essence is poetic, and I believe that. I believe that we're fundamentally poetic beings, and so there's a lot of vitality that can come from that when we engage that way, and it can open up a lot that we might not even, that we often are surprised, we surprise ourselves. Okay. So what is a poem good for? Probably more than this, but we'll see. So I find poems are good for surfacing distinct voices and highlighting particulars of lived experience. They're good for often highlighting possible contradictions or juxtapositions or paradoxes, contradictions, and presenting a more textured, nuanced view of experience. That sometimes, in doing research, you're trying to kind of extract more general meanings. And I've done this kind of research as well, right? Even in nice qualitative narrative research, sometimes we're trying to look across, but sometimes we over-summarize, right? Especially in our desire to say that we know something, right? That we can say something. We're over-summarizing. So poetry brings us back a few steps. And poetry really engages with emotional dimensions, the inner worlds, the unconscious. So when I talk about, the surprises that come sometimes, we surprise ourselves through engaging poetically. Stuff comes, unconscious material, things that we didn't realize we even remembered. And through working with language in careful and conscious and deeper ways, we connect to this more collective, kind of the large pool or ocean that our language and symbol systems come from, the histories of them. And there's so much richness in there. We have so much richness just in our alphabet and so much history, just in a single letter, actually. So, and engage in these ways, it helps surface kind of our deeper human motivations and meanings, because they're there. So this is what Hillary was getting at early on. So poetry does, I believe, help connect the particulars of our lives to a larger sense of self, right? Because all of our objects in our world, they're part of our social world, they're part of our culture, and we have shared meanings and understandings of them, and so they resonate. It's a book, but it has a history, and it has diverse meanings. So when you're exploring it, it gets bigger and bigger sometimes, and then connects the particular experience to emotions. And we know that emotions, we have kind of these universal emotions, even they might be experienced in our particular ways. They connect us to, the big ones like grief or longing that are very human. It helps make the hand, mind, heart of the researcher visible in the inquiry process. So this is what I was talking about before. Poetry connects us to this frame, our sociocultural context. And that's one of the values of it. So it doesn't work to distance ourselves from the research process as an observer, but actually puts us at the center of it. And then our own experience in it says something about what it means to know, and what it means to learn, and what it means to engage and be, and all these fundamental human questions. Close attention to language use and rhetorical strategies brings insight. So I've been going on and on about this. Carl Lego says, we live in a sea of textuality pressed from all sides, which is also kind of a Heidegger idea of like we're born into language, right? And I say a poem is like taking a scoop of this water in hand, right? Like we're just kind of trying to get this sense of this largerness. So your turn. But before we go to that activity, what I want to do is go back to these. And everybody, you all have these books in front of you, and even more books over here. And maybe what we could do is take a few minutes to read some poems, see if you can find one that interests you, that you think has some neat language in it. So the first objective is just to read and maybe enjoy a poem, okay, and to enjoy a poem. Okay, we don't often get to enjoy a poem in our days. The second level, once you've enjoyed a poem, is maybe to say, oh yeah, I think I found one that was, about caring or well-being or health. I think that might be this kind of poem if I was to classify a poem. Or maybe it's about these two things here. Maybe, the author's speaking about their sexuality, but also in the context of being ill in a hospital. And their partner not able to join them because their marriage isn't recognized in a hospital. So it crosses these two. So enjoy a poem and then see if you can identify what trend it might be part of. Has everybody read at least one poem? Yeah? Okay. Did anybody find an example of one of the themes that I... Oh, you have the Voices Visible. So those are kids, K to 12. Yeah, yeah. Now, the books you have weren't written explicitly as poetic inquiry, so it's a little bit of a not quite fair. Yeah. So I had prepared kind of a poetic writing activity, but it takes about 15 to 20 minutes, and I have 12 minutes left. So we're not going to be able to do it, but I'm going to talk you through it because some of you might be interested to do it in a course you're teaching or something like that. And I'll explain the activity a little bit. And then you can imagine how great it would have been if we had done it. So I apologize for that. Okay. All right. So it's this activity I've done, and I've done it with adults a number of times, and I've done it with kids, and it kind of works all the time. So you spread Post-it notes, or you could have slips of paper, it's fine. And at the top of each, you write, I am from. I am from, I am from. So you write 10 times. I usually work with 10. It seems to be about the right amount. And you leave some space below. Okay, so you write, I am from at the top and some space below. And then I share a number of prompts. And the prompts, you can change them depending the group you're working with, but the prompts are intended to get people to write down a concrete image or word or something and have them describe something from their experience. Okay? And you say nothing's off limits, right? This isn't a test of your creative or poetic power. It's just a bit of play. You can always revise it later, etc. And you're trying to get to a specific image, so be descriptive. Okay, so for example, you can, like words that you hear in the hallway every day. Okay, words that you hear in the hallway every day. Okay, oh, I'm so busy. Oh, do you know where the meeting is? Are we still meeting? Okay. Was I supposed to prepare something? Right? Okay. My most favorite thing to eat, right? With a specific, not just noodles, but noodles with the whatever. Okay. My favorite family saying, or maybe one that despite yourself you've remembered and you wish you could get rid of, right? So, my favorite family saying. One of the kindest gestures someone has ever shown me. Okay, so you get the idea, right? Like you're getting, and I put a couple in here, what you would see on my desk, because I want us to think a bit about our context here at work, so things you might hear in the hallway, things you see on your desk. Okay. And if it's nothing, if you have a perfectly clear desk, you say, a perfectly clear surface, always clean. Something I love about the work that I do. I'm happy to share these slides too with anybody if you want them. A person or people who are there for me when I needed help. A place where I love to spend time. A daily happening, something that I do every day. Or maybe forget to do every day, or wish I did every day. Okay? Something that I do every day. A practice or way of being I value in my friendships, family, or workplace. Tools or equipment that I needed for my favorite art hobby. So you can see I'm trying to get to specific objects or things or values. And then what you do is, so you use all of these and you have these statements like, I am from honesty and saying what I mean. I am from, is the meeting going to happen or are you coming? I am from, alpine skis and whatever, right? So you have all these images. And then you work with your words and images and you create a poem from them. And you can repeat I am from like a refrain. So having that nice echo in the poem can be really nice. You can use all of your stickies if you want. You can add to them. You can play with them. Putting them on stickies I find is nicer than just writing I am from 10 times on a sheet. Because if you just write it on a sheet and it's already constructed, it's harder to move stuff around, I find. But when you have stickies, it can you can really move them and play with it and think about the poem in different ways. And you can add new words and da-da-da. So I've done this so, people just write their thing and then share it. And you learn a lot about each other, and sharing it, you learn things you have in common. So I've used it to highlight diversity in groups, but also commonalities. And then I've also had people construct poems, like take each of their individual poems and then construct a group poem. So we are from, right? We are from. And that's neat too, because you're kind of building these identities as groups and putting the particulars in with the group mix. So let me know if you ever do this with a group and how it goes. Okay. All right, well, I was gonna have you experience all that poem and then talk about what you noticed or what came out of it from you. But maybe we could just talk a little bit about questions that emerged for you or different comments that you have at this point. And I have one more slide to share after this about poet as leader. Anything? Go ahead.
Can we do a poetry cafe?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. Yeah.
I would call that out.
Did you?
He was my supervisor for the master's and
Ah.
the different locations. But I did an interpretive inquiry course with him.
Yeah.
It's all about poetry. And it was amazing. I think one of the things, when you said what is poetry good for, and I would add courage. Because people become braver when they're able to play around with words, I think, and be supported in that kind of environment. And stretch their, comfort zone. They're able to step out and learn too. I think it strips away a lot of, because we work so much in our heads, right? Thinking that we know the world from our perspective. But poetry really shatters that apart. And I think it's just a really powerful tool for research. And when I was doing my research, I did a lot of my own poetry just to process the research.
Exactly, right?
Because it helps to process the world, I think, in new ways. But I would love to see a poetry cafe happen.
Well, let's talk. The word courage, if you know from Carl, maybe some of you know, comes from heart, right? Carl. And it's kind of living more from your heart. There's a vulnerability, right, in working poetically that kind of opens us up. Are there any other little comments? Go ahead, Darren.
That brings to mind Courage to Create, Rollo May.
Yeah.
Incredible book about really all of this. And what you've provoked, I had no idea about this trend in poetic inquiry, but I'm thrilled to hear about it. I'm from a background myself, creative writing major in my undergrad degree, and was an editor and associate editor for a number of literary magazines. And going back to those times, all these years of being working in education since, I find myself constantly wishing that we could bring some of that creative, the workshop experience that is part of what writers know to bear in the education at large, because I still have, for all of the ISW and all of the workshops and everything, and all these years of developing new tactics, new strategies, new learning and educational and pedagogical models and everything, still nothing comes close to that for me in terms of what goes in and what you get out of it. And I just found it to be so, as you say, like the courage comes out of it. You learn so much about yourself in the process. It's as interdisciplinary as can be, and it's provocative, and it's just on so many levels. It's a powerful process. And so I just wanted to share that. Just one other thing, from the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about science and the relationship with poetry, and how they're separate fields. But I really wonder, because if you think about the Persian poetry, for instance. We know now that those poets were evoking ideas that have just now been, just in recent years, are being ratified by science. You know, particle, quantum, all of this stuff. They were contending with that and expressing it in ways then. You know, historiography, if you think of Homer, and all of these aspects of what we consider to be now different departmentalized forms of education were contended with by poetry. So it's a matter of just whether there's the reception for it or not, more than anything else, I think.
I hear you. I agree. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we're granting an honorary doctorate to the poet David White next November from Royal Road. So I don't think I let any cats out of bags because it was announced at the public event. So, you know, that question, are we ready for a poet laureate? Well, you know, the ethos is changing, and I think the invitations are here. Having a great presentation like this is also the invitation, you know, so I just wanted to put that out there and say, yay.
Yeah, and I'd like to see a
Yes.
poet laureate thing, every university, every hospital, you know, every school. I'm starting this project with a couple of colleagues, a poet for every school. You know, like this aspiration, right? A poet resident. Here are some words that I came up with, and I adapted a little bit. I went back and read something of Carl's, and I was like, oh, maybe I should cite him there after all. The poet, you know, thinking about leadership, you know, and different values or attributes that we want in ourselves as leaders or in others as leaders. The poet sees, the poet listens, the poet connects, the poet surprises. The poet opens, awakens, imagines, reminds, questions, transforms, loves. And I also would think, you know, there's other words like courage and lots of words we could come up with. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Hi, good. Love Marlene, go ahead. Yes, come up here, Marlene. Oh, here.
Coastal girl, messy, flawed, open, then behind closed doors, cleans up. Personal issues revealed, blown up, blow dried. See you later, alligator. See you in a while, crocodile.
Thank you for that. That's great. Love that. Anybody else? Any parting words?
Actually, we already have a poetry club here.
What?
It's called Dance Leading Us in Singing. Because the songs that we sing in
Yeah.
the choir is poetry. And then we
Oh,
put
yeah.
voices together.
That's true.
Like I have that let things ripen and then fall, force is not the way at all. You know, we do actually have a poetry
Thank you
scene
for-
here through our singing.
Thank you.
And I hope that it continues.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming, everybody, for contributing, for being here and sharing and playing along.
Just want to thank Pamela again on behalf of the Office of Research Services for sharing your heart and soul so beautifully and with such inspiration. I am new to the Office of Research Services and Royal Roads, just been here for a year, and I think one of the things that inspires me the most is learning what is it that motivates all of this research that's going on here, and what is at the heart and soul of each of the researchers that is sparking their imaginations to explore these things. So it was really wonderful to hear your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.